Okay,
Do we have audio?
you can call the meeting to order.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Steve.
Yes.
Yes,
And then
we hear you
You
loud.
can hear me. I cannot hear anybody else.
Oh,
you can't hear me? Ooh.
I would sign to you that I'm calling the meeting to order, but I don't know how to do that.
There we go.
Can you hear us, Steve?
I had to turn it up to 11.
You got quite the amp. All right, let's. I'm going to call to order the Site and Architecture Commission meeting of September 2nd, 2020, and ask Ms. Hamilton if she would start us off with any announcements and then roll call, please.
Okay, commission members, staff, and meeting participants, thank you for joining us this evening for the September 2nd Monte Sereno Site and Architectural Commission meeting. Prior to roll call, I'd like to make it clear for the record of this meeting, and it should be reflected in the minutes, that the Site and Architectural Commission meeting is being conducted pursuant to the provisions of the Brown Act and a recent executive order issued by the governor to facilitate teleconferencing to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission at public meetings. The Brown Act sets strict rules for teleconferencing. It requires that each teleconference location be identified in the notice and agenda, that it be accessible to the public, that members of the public be allowed to address the commission from that location, that agenda be posted at that location, that at least one member be here in the council chambers, and that at least a quorum of the commission be participating from the Monte Sereno, from within Monte Sereno. The governor's executive order has suspended those rules. The executive order does require that we continue to notice meetings in advance and that we provide members of the public an opportunity to offer public comment. Here are some house rules. I'd like to point out a few things to assist commission members, staff, and members of the public to successfully participate in this meeting. Commission members, please keep your microphones muted until you wish to speak. You have a hot mic. For this meeting, we're using Zoom to host the commission meeting. At the bottom of the Zoom client, there are two icons, chat and raise hand. Please use chat only to report technical issues such as being unable to hear the commissioner speaking. Any public comment in the chat window will not be submitted for the record. Please use the raise hand if you'd like to be recognized and enabled to speak to the commission by the chairperson. For the public to comment under oral communications or on any agenda item, emails can be submitted to the planner, limited to 350 words, and they'll be read into the record. I do have my email accessible, so if you do it during the meeting, I should be able to receive it. This limit is set to adhere to the typical 3-minute allowance. Only attendees using the Zoom application can use the raise hand option to comment. Participation from a telephone will allow for listening only and does not allow for any feedback. And finally, because we're not all in the same room, all votes at this meeting will be taken by roll call. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Can we start with roll call then, please?
Yes. Commissioner Harrington?
here.
Commissioner Kroc?
Here.
Commissioner Mekachuk?
Here.
Commissioner Wade? Commissioner Wade?
Yes, I am here.
Chairperson White?
Here, thank you. Ms. Hamilton, are there any orders of the day?
No, everything as is presented in the agenda.
Great, thank you. And for those of you that are participating with us tonight, now is the opportunity for public comment on any matter that is not agendized for this evening. So if there's something that is not on our agenda tonight about which you would like to speak, this is your opportunity to do so. Anybody interested in talking to the commission tonight? Having heard nothing, I will close the public comment portion of the meeting And I will now entertain a motion to approve or edit the minutes from the August 5th meeting that I was absent from.
So to adopt the minutes as written.
Is there a second?
I second it.
Second from Heather. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 I,
Does that work for you, Ms. Hamilton?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, the minutes are approved then. All right, we are now going to segue into our actual agenda tonight. And Ms. Hamilton, I believe the first matter that we're going to address is Alexander Avenue project. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you, Commission. This project is located at 16333 Alexander Avenue. It's a site development permit which proposes to a 130 square foot addition to the ground floor at the front of the existing two-story home, as well as a second story addition of 130 square feet, generally above that ground floor addition. It also includes a approximately 436 square foot addition at the ground floor to the rear of the home. The project does involve some conversion of existing square footage to a junior accessory dwelling unit. And as the Commission is well aware, that portion of the project, the conversion of square footage to the junior accessory dwelling unit, is not subject to discretionary review by the Site and Architectural Commission. There are no significant trees proposed to be removed as a result of the additions. And as you can see in the plans, the proposed additions are consistent with the design and style of the existing two-story home. It does not impact it does not have any visual impacts on surrounding neighboring properties. I apologize, and is consistent with the existing character of the neighborhood. I would suggest that the additions are de minimis related to any impact it has on the streetscape, as well as the overall character of the neighborhood. No real grading is being done as a result of these additions, and the materials to be used as part of the project were submitted as part of your packet, and again are consistent with the existing, as well as integrating new materials to enhance the overall design of the finished design of the home. And with that, I'm available for any questions, and the applicant's representative is on this meeting also.
Jeannie,
Mhm.
Commissioner Wade here. Due to the fact that the applicant is my favorite brother, I would like to recuse myself to eliminate any perception of potential conflict.
Okay, thank you.
How do I do that? Should I just sign
Just
off?
say sign off.
All
Well,
right.
you can walk out of the room.
All right, I'll turn off my volume and walk out of the room.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Wade.
Somebody text me when it's all over.
Okay.
All right.
Heather, that'll be your job. Okay, is there somebody on behalf of the applicant that wants to speak about this project to the commission?
That's,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
we can.
My name is Eric Wade with Wade Construction. I am the contractor and designer who put forth the design, and my clients, the Simons, and I came up with this concept, and we feel that it has all the elements that enhance the neighborhood architecturally, and we're hoping you feel the same.
Great, thank you, Mr. Wade. Do the commissioners have any questions for Mr. Wade? Mr. Simon, I see he's in the audience as well. I don't know if he was planning to speak, but if not, this would be our opportunity to ask him questions if he wasn't planning on a separate presentation. Any questions from our commissioners?
I don't have any questions, but I will say that this afternoon I visited the site with the plans. I looked at the property and I met with both Kim and Dave Simon, and Kim took me to the back of the property and I was able to see everything back there. And I think it looks like they're not making a lot of changes to the exterior, and it seems to be all mainly interior work. I was very impressed with the project.
Okay, anybody else have actual questions for the applicant or its representative, Mr. Wade? All right, hearing none. Is there anybody else in the audience that wanted to speak about this particular project? Looking at the hand feature on Zoom, I don't see anything. If I'm missing somebody, I apologize. Still nothing. And so I'm going to go ahead and close the public comment aspect of this particular application, item 1 on our agenda, and turn this back to the commission for comments. Commissioners, Brian, I heard you and I appreciate your remarks. Thank you. Ms. Harrington or Ms. Kroc, do either one of you have comments regarding this particular project?
I think it looks beautiful. I think that the most like the backyard is probably the backyard is probably the most I'm sorry. Go ahead. Someone else.
I'll go ahead and jump in here. I would echo Brian's comments. I think it's a very benign addition. It'll be an improvement to the neighborhood, and I have no objection to it.
I concur with that sentiment. I think this is going to be a positive influence on this particular neighborhood, and I'd be surprised if anybody really notices a real distinction because the architectural features are very similar to what's out there now. With that said, is anybody want to make a motion to approve this application as submitted?
I move that we approve the application as submitted.
Is there a second?
I will second that. But I also wanted to make a comment in the discussion after the motion.
Okay, but you're seconding the motion as well, right, Brian?
That is correct. I will second the motion.
Okay, does your comment need to be made before we vote or after?
No, I think before. I asked the applicant a number of questions, or the applicant, I guess it's the Simons. I asked if they spoke with the neighbors, if there were any objections, and they said no, that the neighbors were all pleased with it, and no one seems to be commenting on it. But that was I asked them a number of questions on site, to which I received favorable responses. So I just wanted to make sure that I shared that with the commission.
Thank you, Brian, very much. We're always very appreciative when applicants communicate with their neighbors well in advance of this hearing, so we don't have to reconcile the differences of opinion amongst them. All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, and I'm going to do this by way of roll call to make it easy on Ms. Hamilton. Mr. Mekachuk, how do you vote?
Vote in favor of the application, yes.
Ms. Harrington?
Yes.
And Ms. Kroc?
Yes.
And I will join with a yes, and that will be a 4-0 with Mr. Wade abstaining. Thank you, guys, and good luck with your project. The better, Mr. Wade and Mr. Simon. Thank you. Okay, with that, I think we can move to the second item on our agenda, which I see is 17703 Blanchard Drive, which is a tree removal application. And Ms. Hamilton, if you could introduce that particular application, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Has Commissioner Wade rejoined us?
Oh, I don't know yet. That's a very good point. Thank you.
I don't have his number. I can't text him.
Well, that wasn't even enough time to eat anything.
Well, your brother's so eloquent and concise with his words. It just makes things so much
Yeah.
easier. All right, welcome back. And I think
Thanks.
we're looking at item 2, if everybody's ready, on our agenda tonight, at 17703 Blanchard Drive.
Thank you, Commissioners. Yes, what you have before you is a tree removal permit, tree removal request for 17703 Blanchard Drive. It includes the removal of 3 significant trees, and as you can see in the information distributed to you all, this property is at the corner of Blanchard and Vineland. There's a pretty small frontage on Blanchard, and their request is to remove 1 liquid amber tree, which is approximately 38 inches in circumference. One, I believe it's kind of like a silk oak tree, which is approximately 50, no, the silk oak is approximately 38 inches in circumference also. And then around the corner on Vineland, you'll see that there's a smaller redwood tree that's approximately 51 inches in circumference that has popped up and growing, within 5 or so feet of the home and starting to compete with the other 2 more significant redwood trees on the corner. The applicants have asked me to represent their project in front of you, given their technology, and hopefully they don't take offense, but they're an older couple in the community. They are more concerned about that larger redwood tree, which has like a 15-foot circumference that's there adjacent to their driveway. And this oak tree is growing rapidly, and it's really kind of a volunteer from a tree that's on an adjacent property, and somehow it kind of got away from them. So they're wanting to remove that oak tree to free up space for the larger redwood tree, which they've done significant work in the recent past to ensure that it can continue to be viable. They redid their driveway. They kind of regraded some of the area so that the roots could be exposed and or were not causing the damage that they can. Again, also the liquid amber tree is in the front, and coupled with the oak tree is casting an enormous amount of shade on their front yard area, such that it's making it more difficult for the rest of their landscaping to thrive. That volunteer oak tree also sheds a lot of leaf litter on their roof, and conscientious as they are, they have to get out there and try to remove it on an annual basis, and have concerns related to potential fire hazard. The small redwood tree, as I indicated earlier, has grown up very close to their house foundation, and we all know how redwood tree roots can take control of an area. By removing this one smaller redwood tree, again, it frees up space and eliminates any competition with the 2 more significant redwood trees at the corner of their property. So again, you're not seeing an arborist report because they're not requesting to remove them due to disease or anything. It's really to support the other trees on the site, as well as eliminate what, as you can kind of see, an overcrowding situation with very large trees in a very small front yard area. With that, I'm available for any comments and or questions. Sorry.
Thank you, Jeannie. Is it safe to assume from your comments that the applicants are not here to make any sort of presentation?
I believe so because they requested that I speak on their behalf.
Okay. And just to give everybody an opportunity, anybody here on behalf of the applicant that we're unaware of that wants an opportunity to speak about this particular request? All right, hearing nothing, is there anybody else in the audience tonight that wants to talk about this particular agenda item, about the removal of trees at this address? And silence again. So with that, I'm going to close the public comment portion of our meeting, and as well as an opportunity for the applicant to speak, and bring it back to the commission. And Jeannie, I do have one question, or a couple questions actually. If any of these are significant trees under the code, and what types of findings, if any, does the commission need to make in relationship to considering this application?
Sorry, first, the first finding that would need to be made would be that significant tree or trees need to be removed to allow reasonable economic enjoyment of the property, or the significant trees need to be removed due to disease, danger of falling, or threat to owners or surrounding residents. I think in the case of these trees, you know, the overcrowding, the threat to the other larger trees, the lack of ability to really enjoy that front yard area is what's causing them to want to move those liquid amber and the silk tree, silk oak from their front yard. The also, with respect to the redwood tree, the concern is that the proximity to their foundation is going to cause damage and an economic hardship should they have to go in and do any sort of repair. You can trim or you can sever tree roots, but they'll find another way to make to grow out to where they need to. The next finding would be that if the topography of the land and the effect of the removal of the significant trees will have an effect on erosion, soil retention, and diversion or increased flow of surface waters. This is a flat property, so therefore the removal is not going to impact any of the soil or impact or increase soil erosion. It's not going to increase runoff. Again, this is a smaller yard area, landscaped, and the drainage is captured with existing landscaped areas and the street improvements. The third finding would be that the number of trees existing in the neighborhood on improved property and the effect the removal would have on established standard of the area and the property values. As you can see, there's already several significant trees on this property, which with the removal of the two smaller trees between the redwoods on the corner and that very large redwood at the driveway would really not diminish, I think, the impact or the effect of the existing trees. This is some of the, you know, half-acre to up to half-acre lots in the general area. They all have very good landscaping on their properties. So again, these being the smaller trees on this site would not impact it. You know, the council can always request that replacement trees be planted. If you can look on one of the streetscape that I have that shows the liquid amber tree and the oak tree, if you look beyond them, there are some crepe myrtles in there that, because they get such shade, they've been limited in their growth. So by removing these larger trees, the smaller landscape trees will be able to flourish and, you know, fill in at the appropriate location the foliage there. And that the number of trees the particular parcel can adequately support is there according to good forestry practices. Again, this is, you know, a typical lot in this neighborhood. It's already got significant large trees on it, and with the removal of these 3 trees, it's going to be supporting, I think, enough trees on the property, given the size of the remaining trees.
Thank you, Jeannie, very much. That's helpful. Go ahead, Brian.
A couple of questions for you, and I think I missed it at the beginning. The owners of the property, the applicant, how long have they been living at that location, approximately?
Well, probably since the 70s,
Does that really matter?
but
At this
they're long-term residents.
That's what I wanted to hear, Heather. I wanted to know that they're long-term residents. So they've got the best interest of Monte Sereno at heart and maintaining the look and feel of Monte Sereno. My second question is, did any neighbors object to the removal of the trees after it was posted?
I have not heard any comments from any buddy relative to this project.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Any other commissioners have any questions for Ms. Hamilton, or can we begin a discussion amongst ourselves? Silence is golden. All right, we're going to turn this back to the commission for discussion amongst ourselves. Does anybody want to first speak about this particular application?
Sure, I'll say something. As far as the condition of the trees, they all appear to be very healthy and thriving. I understand the desire to remove the smaller redwood around the corner. It's kind of up against the power lines there, and if you look at the photo, you can see the tree down the way, the larger tree that's been pruned to avoid the power lines. So eventually, I assume this tree will be pruned that way, which isn't a good thing. So no issue with the small redwood tree. The other 2 small trees, I just, you know, sure, I'd like to see them stay, but I kind of get the concerns with the homeowner, and, you know, kudos to them for keeping the larger, messier trees, those redwoods. So I do feel that they kind of have the interest of maintaining the rural character, as Brian mentioned. So I just don't have enough in front of me to strongly object, I guess, to the removal of all 3 trees.
Thank you, Steve. Jennifer?
I concur.
Heather?
I agree pretty much with what Steve is saying. At first, I was kind of not in favor of removing, they're just such beautiful trees, the liquid amber and the oak, but you can see that there are smaller trees in the background that will flourish and thrive. So I feel like I have to agree with the removal of the trees.
And Brian?
I was wondering about replacement trees, but if you think, the way I see it, the trees in behind, the smaller ones that Jeannie referred to, those will grow much faster and better with the removal of the 2 trees in front. So while normally I would think, you know, what's the replacement? I think the replacement has already been made. So I could certainly support the removal of the trees.
I agree. I think this application is the result of perhaps some deferred maintenance in relationship to allowing those 2 trees in the front to get so large. I do understand the need to remove the redwood tree on the side, and I would certainly support that. And I think because it will ultimately provide some sort of problem to the residents in relationship to the foundation and the other competing 2 redwood trees around it. I think that the 2 trees in the front, though, may very well need to be removed to allow reasonable economic enjoyment of the property, because if they're not, then the adjoining huge redwood tree there is definitely going to uproot the driveway, if not ultimately the home's foundation with time. And removing those trees will give it an opportunity to grow and have some place for the roots to branch out to. So with that, I would also support the application. Does anybody want to make a motion?
Sure. I'll move that the application be approved as is for the removal of the 3 trees.
Thank you, Steve. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Heather.
I second it.
Thank you, Heather. Brian, how do you vote?
I vote for, yes.
Ms. Harrington,
Yes.
Ms. Kroc,
Yes.
and Mr. Wade?
Yes.
All right, I will also vote yes. That will be 5-0 on item 2 on our agenda. And wish the Barretts well for us, please, Ms. Hamilton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that leaves the last item on our agenda tonight, which is a proposed ordinance that will modify fence heights. And as you folks may recall, we had this issue before us, I think, in either April or May of last year. And it circled back to us with some revisions, some of which we talked about at our meeting last spring, and some of which are new. Jeannie, can you introduce this subject for us and give us some directive about what decisions we're to make tonight, please?
Thank you, Chairperson White. As you stated, at the June 2nd City Council meeting, staff did present the proposed ordinance to the council, and it had come to the commission previously at your May 6th, 2020 meeting for a public hearing. As proposed at that time, the commission did recommend that the council approve it. That ordinance basically included a citywide increase of the fence height from 6 feet up to 7 feet. And it included some exceptions in the area of adjacency to a property in the county. Because those properties could do an 8-foot fence, you'd be allowed to do an 8-foot fence. And then also adjacent to commercial properties, the proposed ordinance at that time recommended a allowance of up to 8 feet, and those would be as of right, with the understanding that because those fence heights would be over 7 feet, you would need a building permit. When this went to the city council, council members, I think, had thought a little more, and they were wondering whether or not any additional exceptions might be warranted. For example, adjacent to, let's say, a public, quasi-public use, such as a church and or a public school, or along busy streets or whatnot. And then they suggested to staff that I needed to reach out to the public and get their input on it. Well, on that directive, I went ahead and learned a new skill. I hopped on SurveyMonkey and I created a survey, a residential fence survey. We launched it at the end of, I think it was at the end of June, and it ran through July. So from June 24th through July, I included the actual questions. And again, when you do surveys like that, you really want to be short and sweet, not get too complicated, because again, it's, you know, you want to keep it simple. And then I also included, you know, which was interesting, asking where the respondents were from relative to their location that they lived in. And believe it or not, we do have identified neighborhoods in our general plan. So I used that, and it linked to a map so that they could identify what neighborhood the city, thinks that they live in. So as a result, again, I think, the survey demonstrated that over 82% of the respondents do support a fence of 7 feet in height along their side and their rear property lines. That's very consistent with how a lot of other communities do their side and rear property lines. When asked whether they felt it was appropriate to allow a taller fence under certain circumstances, a number of residents said yes. And again, you can see in the staff report on page 3, I included the different areas just to kind of throw it out there again. If you're adjacent to commercially used property, if you're along a major arterial, if you're share a property line with a church or school, and whether or not you're adjacent to a property that's in the county. People overwhelmingly thought that was they were appropriate, but if you start thinking about how many parcels would be involved in any one of these exceptions, you can see that the ones that are immediately adjacent to a commercially used property, and I use adjacency as a shared property line, and that's how we did it. I'm not proposing that we use adjacent defined as across a street or across and one property over. Our ordinance includes shared property line. So when you look at the number of properties that could be affected by these proposed exceptions, you see we have approximately 3 properties in the city that would qualify for one if they shared a property line with a commercially used property. You'd have approximately 41 when you look at properties that share a property line with a church or a school. Those are the public, quasi-public uses. You have approximately 30 properties that would share, I just saw a typo, share a property line with a property in the county. And, those, again, because the county property can put up an 8-foot fence, that could happen regardless, really, of what we have. But then when you have properties along a major arterial, you get 142. And then if you really think through that, that could potentially allow a walling off or walls along some major streetscapes, such as Winchester, Dave's, Quito, which is, can be pretty scenic, and Highway 9, with the exception that we would probably control that more because it's a scenic highway. So although we, did put that exception in our survey, and, people said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Thinking through it from a planning standpoint, those major thoroughfares are kind of a visual asset to the city, and there'd be real question as to whether or not we'd want to allow, as of right, increased properties, increased fencing along those, even if it was only for side and or rear properties, property lines. I think, the rest of the staff report kind of, puts out, even with these exceptions, those, ultimately that if the city were to adopt these exceptions, they are going to have to get building permits, and there's going to be a cost associated with all of that, and so I put a little discussion of that. Ultimately, again, as a result of the survey and our further analysis, staff still is recommending that, as a result of the overwhelming support for the increase in fence height, that we do modify the citywide fence height allowance from 6 feet up to 7 feet for your side and your rear property lines. There does not appear to be any support for a height over that. And then as far as the staff's recommendations for any exceptions, we would continue to support an exception of up to 8 feet for those properties that share a common property line with one in the county, again, where the fence height is already allowed to be 8 feet as of right, and those that share a common property line with commercially used properties. We also would say, suggest that, again, because of the limited number of properties involved and the potential benefits for a little higher fence height, that we allow that same exception for properties that share a common property line with a church or a school. So it would be on that common property line between the two uses. And I think, as I just stated, the potential visual impact with an exception related to the major roadways, in staff's opinion, would be too great, and to the city's streetscapes, and we would not recommend support of that. So with that, I'm available for any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hamilton. I have one question before we get started, and that is in relationship to what specifically we're to accomplish with respect to this particular ordinance. Are we to vote to have a first reading and then deliver it to the city council? What specifically are we tasked with in relationship to this potential amendment?
Yeah, so you're a recommending body to the city council. So as presented in the recommendation up front on page 1, basically we're asking that you recommend to the city council how to proceed with an ordinance, if you feel they should proceed with an ordinance, and if so, what should that ordinance include. So as I said, planning staff is recommending that you as a commission recommend that the city council introduce and hold the first reading of an ordinance of the city of Monte Sereno amending chapter 10.06, section 10.06.130, height of fences by increasing the height from 6 feet to 7 feet, with an exception up to 8 feet in certain circumstances. And again, as I stated, it would be shared property lines with commercially used properties, shared property lines with churches or schools, and why am I drawing a blank? The county properties, shared property lines with county properties where the allowed fence height is already 8 feet.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Hamilton. We had received a letter in opposition to this particular measure. Is that correct?
Yes, and I hang on a second. We received an email from a Mr. Scott Mosier on August 28th, and I forwarded that to the commission.
Yes, thank you.
And unless he's not participating, I will read those comments into the...
I see him as an attendee, and Mr. Mosier, if your letter speaks for itself, that's fine, but I will open this matter to public comment now, and this would be an opportunity for you to speak to the commission in relationship to this particular issue. Something that's not reflected in your letter would be ideal. Do you wish to speak? I see you prop up. There you go.
Yeah, the letter speaks for itself. The only one question that I had was how many people responded to the Survey Monkey that provided responses of 82%, I believe, in favor of the 7-foot height.
It's a good question.
We had 146 responses to the survey.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
I would say the only addition that I would add to my letter would be that I can understand some of the exceptions up to 8 feet, commercial property and otherwise that have been discussed here as being appropriate exceptions, but would still, respectfully request that we keep it at 6 feet. I think 6 feet is an appropriate height across Monte Sereno to preserve the charm and character of the neighborhood.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you for your letter. Appreciate
Absolutely. Thank you.
Anybody else from the public that wants to speak on this particular matter? I don't see anybody else, I don't believe. Hearing nothing, I'm going to close our public comment portion of the hearing with respect to item 3 on the agenda and turn it back to my commissioners. I'll tell you guys right off the bat, I don't have any issue with any of the exceptions. We've talked through this particular height issue already once, and I think there's general support for it. I think Jennifer brought up some great concerns last time about properties bordering other jurisdictions where the fence heights may not be reconciled with those of Monte Sereno, and what do we do in that instance? And I think this ordinance, as fashioned or drafted, actually addresses those exceptions. The only exception that staff did not recommend, and I'm interested in your guys' input on, is the one related to properties that border some of the major thoroughfares, if you will, in Monte Sereno, such as Winchester Boulevard, Quito, and Highway 9. Does anybody have a sense that that type of exception warrants further consideration and possible?
I believe it does, and I'm wondering if that exception could be handled through an application to site and architecture, so that it's not blanket, but it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's a function of what's similar to Los Gatos, where anyone can make an application for a fence that is not allowed to be 8 feet, but you can make it up to 8 feet. So I'm wondering if we could include that type of an exception as well. I think the number of applications would be few and far between, but at least that ability is there. And I will say that the litigation from the Paget fence ordeal from years ago is still ongoing. We're still paying for litigation for attorneys from that from years ago.
Yeah, that was quite a while ago. Actually, Brian's point raises a question for you, Ms. Hamilton. I think you mentioned in relationship to all of these exceptions that somebody would have to apply for a permit, but is there any circumstance under which such an application for a permit under one of these exceptions would circle back before the Site and Architecture Committee?
No, the ordinance as proposed basically codifies an exception in those discrete circumstances. So if you have a shared property line with a commercially used property, as of right, you can put up an 8-foot fence. The permit that would be required is a building permit, because the only fencing that's exempt from a building permit is a 7-foot tall fence. Anything over 7 feet requires a building permit. So in the case of those exceptions, it's an as of right if they meet that criteria of the shared property line with the commercially used property, shared with a school or church, or shared with a county property in the county. The requirement, if the commission wanted to consider a requirement for a site development permit for any other sort of exception, you would have to create criteria within from which you would determine whether or not you could support it or not. So it's not, you have to create some findings that would support your approving an 8-foot fence along a major thoroughfare in one instance, but not in another. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Hamilton. Fellow commissioners, does that, Brian's point is a salient one, and maybe there ought to be exceptions under circumstances where you're bordering a major thoroughfare. Does anybody support that type of?
Yes, I do. I'm just thinking along Highway 9 or Keto or another thoroughfare. If your property is lower than the highway, you probably want a higher fence, which I could totally understand. If your property is higher than the road, you probably wouldn't. But I would think that could be on a case-by-case basis where, you know, you might need an 8-foot fence if your property were lower than the road.
Good points. Heather or Steve, you guys have any input on this?
I'm not a fan of the 8-foot anywhere, but I do understand the three circumstances. You know, especially if you're abutting county property and they can build an 8-foot fence, well then, okay, that's kind of a no-brainer. The church or school or the commercial properties, it's relatively few in number, so it's not like Monte Sereno is going to be plagued with 8-foot fences as a result. I'm kind of against the 8-foot exception for major arterial ways. I just don't think that walled effect is desirable. It just doesn't sit well with me, I guess. And then as far as the 7-foot goes, I mean, you know, densification is coming. People are building ADUs 4 foot off each other's fences now with no permit or no site and architecture review at all. They can just do it. So a 6-foot fence with a ADU 4 foot off the neighbor's fence is, I don't feel adequate. And especially on some of the smaller lots in Monte Sereno, I live on a smaller lot. A 6-foot fence, you know, my neighbor's deck is 2 foot above the ground, and it's kind of silly. We're just looking at each other. On the larger properties, you know, people with a little bit more land, a little more space between them and their property line, I can see why, you know, a 6-foot fence would be perfectly adequate. But in my particular case, it's not. So I don't object to the 7-foot in general.
Heather?
So I was noticing in the matrix that Jeannie prepared that the cities that don't allow anything over 6 feet are side communities, Los Altos Hills, Portola Valley. And I'm wondering if maybe we want to divide, I don't want to make this harder than it is, divide it into like larger lots on the Highway 9 side, or there's some on our side too that, you know, maybe a 7-foot fence isn't appropriate on those larger lots that are on the natural hillside for our community. Just a thought. I don't really support having 8-foot tall fences on like Winchester or Keto. I think it's going to create too much of a walled effect, but I am in support for the most part for the 7-foot fence. And the exceptions of the church and commercial properties and county situations. Do you guys have any input on maybe the more hillside lots that are larger?
So what I think you're saying is that we change the fence height according to the zoning.
Yeah.
If you're in downtown Monte Sereno, you can have one size fence, but if you're in a hillside area, you get another size fence. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I'm just kind of weighing that out in my mind. I'd love your input, especially you, Jennifer. You live in a more hillside community. Do you want to have a taller fence in your neighborhood? I live in a tightly packed, I live in the slums. So it's appropriate, I think, in, tighter circumstances
Mhm.
to have a taller fence, but I don't know, is it appropriate for your neighborhood?
Nobody has one, so I can't say from personal experience
Yeah.
because they're really not an issue. But I can see that in a more densely populated issue, or place you might want, as Steve, I think, said, that, if the neighbor has a 2-foot deck, so they're staring at each other, I can see that a bigger fence. But then again, where in one of the hillside areas, no one's going to notice a tall fence. It's just not, it's out there somewhere.
True.
So I don't really see the need for,
Breaking it apart.
yeah, I don't see the need for breaking it down, because I don't think somebody in a 2-acre, a 1-acre, 2-acre lot, would it really matter if they had a 8-foot or a 6-foot fence or a 7-foot fence?
Well, and to Steve Wade's point too, someone even on a big, large lot like that could still put an ADU 4 feet from the fence. So that might be a reason to just make it a little bit higher.
Yeah.
I guess the bottom line for I think going to 7 feet's just fine, with the exceptions of county, commercial, and church properties.
All right, I'll chime in. I agree with Steve. I hate seeing people fence themselves in. I think that's an awful look. When the taller the fence, the worse it looks. But I don't envy those folks who also are having their neighbors construct an ADU 4 feet from their fence and they have zero privacy. And so I'm wondering, aloud in front of all of you, whether we need to perhaps consider this matter a little bit further and find out if there can be criteria under which we would consider, and they would come before us as a reviewing body, applications for taller fences that we might not otherwise approve because the circumstances suggest that that may be more appropriate at that location. Would you guys be interested in tabling this matter and affording ourselves an opportunity to do that research and coming back with something that we might all be supportive of?
So, Steve, if I understand you correctly, you're saying let's keep it at 6 feet, but allow 7 feet in certain circumstances, kind of depending upon what all's going on, and then maybe keep the 8-foot for those 3 cases. Is that kind of something you're?
I'm saying tonight we take zero action other than an agreement to look at this issue further and develop better criteria under which fence heights will be evaluated, either 6, 7, or 8. Anywhere that there's going to be an exception, I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be appropriate for a reviewing body such as Site and Architecture to review those. Brian's residence is right on Winchester. It makes sense from my perspective for him to have a taller fence, provided he creates some sort of a green frontage so we're not just staring at fences when we drive down Winchester. But at other locations on a tall bluff or tall side of Highway 9, I don't think you need an 8-foot fence up there, or a 7-foot fence for that matter. And so what I'm speaking to out loud is whether we ought to table this matter. If we're going to create circumstances under which applicants can bring these types of projects before a reviewing body, such as Site and Architecture, we need to develop criteria so that the commission knows exactly what it is it's evaluating. And so by tabling this, it affords us an opportunity to create such criteria and then reconsider this particular measure with exceptions that are premised upon certain findings that have to be made by a reviewing body.
This is Jeannie.
Yes.
Can I chime in a little bit?
I'm not trying to make work. I'm just.
No, I understand. What I'd like to do is kind of take us back to the original discussion, months ago. Fencing is something that is as of right. You generally want to make it consistent citywide so that you're not creating different standards for different people just based on a zoning district that even though they're in this zoning district, they got the same size property and stuff like that. They're not going to get building permits for this. You do already have the ability, I mean, I think the way the fence height regulations are currently structured, there is a limitation to the fence height within the front setback area and within the side corner setback area. That fence height is limited to 3 feet. Well, I think because those areas are long roadways, there is the ability for the property owner to request an exception to that 3-foot height to go up to 6 feet at the discretion of site and architecture. What you want to try not to do is really create a complicated matrix to try and think through every different circumstance. Commissioner Mekachek did come in, and he actually did exercise his right to request an exception to the fence height in the side corner. So there's that design of, yeah, you can either codify an as of right exception, which again, you know, especially with the county properties, especially with, you know, adjacent to commercial, those are exceptions that are reflective of that criteria so that you don't need to exercise discretion. The situation is there, it warrants a higher fence, not a problem. If you're going to do something similar to that along major thoroughfares, you're going to have to really think through what are the different criteria that need to be met in order to get that different height. And I would caution against saying, well, this one can go to 7 feet, but this one can go to 8. Really think through the complexity of what you want to do to these fence regulations. Because 7 foot, up to 7 feet, people aren't going to get a building permit, and they may not want to come in and get a site development permit. So I hear what you're saying, Commissioner White. To the extent that there are clear criteria already and you can codify that criteria and create an as of right exception, you're best off. If you want to create an exception that you're going to want to exercise discretion, you really need to think through the criteria that you think needs to be there in order to approve that higher fence height. Currently, when people request, come before you for a site development permit for an increase in fence height in their front yard or their side corner, typically that's because they are along a roadway, and in some instances, you don't necessarily allow them to go all the way to the property line. You do require some sort of setback for buffering and softening of that wall along the street. So there is that, you know, existing format that's available to you. You may want to either use that or I don't know.
Those are
Keep it as simple as practical. That's what I'm trying to suggest.
No, I very much appreciate your remarks, Ms. Hamilton, because the last thing that this commission wants to do is to create more subjective criteria for us to
Yeah.
evaluate.
I totally agree with that.
And Brian, you had a comment. I'm sorry.
I have a couple of comments. First of all, I think that there are exceptions that will pop up, and to create an algorithm that's going to work perfectly in every instance is not, it's admirable, but I don't think it's achievable. It's often, I would say, a leading practice, for example, by Los Gatos, where they have the ability to approve a fence of up to 8 feet. Now, if they do that on an exception basis, there's a couple of things. First of all, the cost of an 8-foot fence is non-trivial. They're expensive. And, so that's a deterrent to, just anyone throwing up an 8-foot fence. As well, it has to go through a building permit. So, you've got to draft up plans and show, where the posts are going to be, how deep they're going to be, what they're going to be embedded in, all the stuff. I think Commissioner Wade knows that in spades. And then as well, along Winchester and other locations, there's going to be buildings that are built, commercial buildings, and they can be up to 35 feet tall. And I believe Commissioner Wade knows that there's buildings that are approved, site development permits that have been approved on Winchester. So, I think that the criteria that were put together by staff were really good, and they'll capture virtually every instance, but I think you still want to leave an exception ruling or opportunity. And Los Gatos has that, so it's not like we're recreating the wheel. Stephen, I would say that we can look at the Los Gatos exceptions and what's required, if we were to table this. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Brian. Oh, all right. Heather, Steve, and Jennifer, are you guys prepared to entertain and decide a motion about whether to recommend, I think that's what we're ultimately doing here, that City Council introduce and hold the first reading of this unnumbered ordinance that will modify sections 10.06.130 and 10.08040 of our municipal code?
I would recommend it as presented.
Heather and Steve, are you guys ready to decide this matter, or would you want more information?
Well, I look at Los Gatos, for example, on the side, and they're allowing 6 feet plus 1 foot lattice or 6 feet in hillside. So they have some sort of mechanism to deal with some of the more rural properties. And I'd be interested in understanding that a little bit better, I guess.
If I can interject, the Los Gatos fence height stuff, they got into the whole discussion relative to wildlife corridors and wildlife, not putting fencing up to impede the movement of wildlife across properties and stuff like that. And that's why you're seeing that sort of treatment in Los Gatos. Let me throw this out. There's nothing to keep you from saying that you're supportive of these sort of changes, and you would also recommend that the council direct staff to further look into additional or appropriate way to possibly address an exception in this area. It's certainly up to you. You can either hold up the whole thing, or again, this is it's been around for a while. So is there any part of this you feel comfortable moving forward at this time? And then also recommending that the council direct staff to continue to look into further opportunities to modify or create exceptions in certain circumstances.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. So, and that's exactly what I'm asking, Steve and Heather. And Jennifer's already said yes, and Brian would like to see more work done on it. But as to Steve and Heather, are you guys ready to decide this matter tonight?
I'll speak next. Can I just clarify something to go along with what Jeannie was saying about Los Gatos? So Los Gatos' zoning is different than ours. They have hillside designations. We just have our 144 lots. They have they put a HS on theirs with Hillside, so I'm sure that's how they make their distinction between. I guess I would like to not, I'd like to put it off for tonight so that we can make a good decision on this. I know that we've considered it before. I'm still not quite sure what I think. And I feel like fences have been an issue in our city in the past, and maybe we need to take a little deeper look at it all.
Yeah, I hear you, Heather. I understand this is a very sensitive issue in Monte Sereno, and I definitely appreciate all the effort that Jeannie's put in to this time, you know, in terms of the survey and all of that. And I don't want to sit here and spin wheels and rehash this again and again and again, but I'm a little on the fence. And I don't want to force this through unless I feel totally comfortable with it.
Well, I will just say again that I really take what Jeannie said to heart, in that the fewer subjective categories there are, the better. The more objective we can make it. So I think if we do table it, we need to keep that in mind, that we need to be totally make objective rules rather than subjective.
Agreed.
Okay, so I'm hearing everybody. I'd like to make a motion that we recommend City Council return this matter to staff to establish or evaluate whether objective criteria can be established for exceptions to fence heights, either at the 8-foot height, or if we're not going to adopt the 7-foot, the 6-foot height, so that each circumstance can be evaluated on its own.
Well, no, I think that's what we're trying to get away from, is everything being evaluated on its own. We want more objective rules than subjective.
I'm not so sure of that.
Maybe
I think a fence height of a larger section may be appropriate in certain circumstances, and I think we should be able to establish criteria where findings can be made where that can occur.
Oh, yes. But for the majority being objective, and then yes, you've got the outliers.
All right, so much for motion making.
Can I ask a question here?
Absolutely.
So currently, and again, I'm just trying to help, spur more discussion for my own sake, in case I'm charged with doing additional research, which I'm more than happy to do. But so right now we have citywide 6 feet, whether you're in the hillside, whether you're on the flatlands, regardless of zoning designation or what. And we do not regulate what sort of fencing. If you do go to Los Gatos or Portola Valley or some of those other truly rural communities, you're going to start to see that they're not only regulating fence height, but they're regulating it for purposes of allowing, wildlife, movement of wildlife in the hillsides and openness in nature and stuff like that. So, currently we're pretty straightforward in our fencing regulations. So the one question would be, are we going to stick with that citywide? This is what staff would like to really understand, or would a simple 1-foot increase in fence height be enough that you don't want to consider it citywide? Let's take the exceptions off the table right now. So just looking at a citywide fence height change to side and rear property lines, is that now a concern from 6 feet to 7 feet citywide?
Now that you put it that way, Jeannie, I guess I don't really have a a problem with going to a 7-foot fence throughout without the exceptions. Anybody else want to weigh in? I mean, I know I'm kind of backtracking on what I originally said, but at the same time, I don't want to make it a super complicated issue where we have to look at every single fence that comes through Monte Sereno at site and architecture. Do we really want to become that city? I mean, we're already known for our fence gate issue from the Paget lawsuit. Anyway, I'm just going to put that out there. Do we really want to have them all go through site and architecture and have some sort of review on fences?
No, we don't.
Yeah, and I mean, this discussion was spurred by the one exception we're not considering, which is major thoroughfare bordered properties. I guess what I'm considering is whether we entertain a motion to recommend that the resolution as drafted be read. I don't know. We make a recommendation to City Council that we support it, but we would like to see some means by which people who have properties that border major thoroughfares can come to the city and have larger fences under particular circumstances. Is that a fair assessment of how everybody feels?
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the 7-foot is appropriate in some of the more densely, more dense neighborhoods. And then I kind of go back to what Jennifer said, where she's like, if you have a giant piece of property and you stick a 7-foot fence out 300 feet away, it's like, who cares, right? So, yeah. So I don't know. I think, and I understand the desire to make it simple. I mean, if it gets too complicated, then we're mired in reviews and exceptions and all that. So I'm kind of leaning toward going with the 7-foot citywide for the normal case. And then I'm not quite sure where to go with the exceptions beyond that.
Jeannie, is that making progress?
Well, I think it's appropriate to kind of, split out what's not truly an issue in the commission's mind, and then what areas that you feel make sense, and then what areas you think might warrant further consideration. Again, ordinances can, even when it gets to council, they may adopt it as presented or just a portion of it. So, you don't have to necessarily final craft the wording per se. But if you feel that an exception under certain circumstances for properties, and again, for these properties along major thoroughfares, you have a mix of properties that may have a front property line, a side property line, or a rear property line along these. So major thoroughfares. So, you'd want to make sure that, currently, if somebody has a front property line along any street, and they want a fence higher than 3 feet, you already have the model of having to come before the Site and Architectural Commission for approval of a fence height any higher than 3 feet within that front setback. So there's already that model, which if we utilize a similar model just for exceptions for properties along major thoroughfares, that we may want to look at the directives or the findings that we've created for the commission to make and ensure that they're, tight, they make sense, and they're not arbitrary. Don't leave for real arbitrary decisions.
What if we were to allow or increase it to 7 feet for side and rear? And the only exception would be where you abut or share a property line with a different jurisdiction that has different fence height, then the less restrictive rule applies. And anything else has got to come before review if they want anything higher than that.
We can't control that the less restrictive, because in theory that property line is a common property line. So one property owner has a right to put up an 8-foot fence, the other property. So it's,
So that's why,
although we're creating that exception,
that's why
it's
less
really just to make consistency.
No, I'm saying the taller fence can go in that case. The less.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize. It's been a long day. Yeah, I mean, in our case, the only adjacent jurisdiction that has a taller fence is County of Santa Clara.
Right. And so in those cases where it's that 8-foot rule there, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Then of course, they can put an 8-foot fence up. So, their Monte Sereno neighbor should be able to put up an 8-foot fence.
Correct.
Anything beyond that, I think should come before review. And then if they can make a good case, that the school's too loud or whatever, we need an 8-foot fence, we can look at it on a case-by-case basis. It's not that many properties we're talking about.
It's fewer than 200 properties, according to this chart.
Okay, I would support Steve's soon-to-be-made motion, I hope. Anybody else? Does anybody have any objection to it? So we can just move forward a little bit. Maybe that's the easiest way.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
So can you restate, when you make the motion, can you restate it so that I can ensure I get it correct?
I'll do my best. Are you ready?
Yes.
Heather, you got any problem with that?
No, I'm with you.
All right. So I move that we increase the allowable fence height at side and rear yards from 6 feet to 7 feet. The only exception to that would be where the property line is shared by another jurisdiction that allows a taller fence height, in which case the less restrictive fence height would apply.
I second that motion.
Second it.
All right. Brian, how do you vote?
Muted.
We can't hear you, Brian.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
So are we going to entertain exceptions in the future at all, or is it, that's it?
We always entertain exceptions. I mean, anybody can ask for an exception.
Okay, then I vote in favor, yes.
And Heather?
Yes.
And Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay, and Steve?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to vote. I appreciate the correspondence we got from the Mosers, and I'm not a big fence fan, but to Steve's point earlier, which I think is significant, and I think more significant to us because we see it on a monthly basis, the number of ADUs and JADUs that are growing and will be placed in close proximity to fence lines warrants an increase in fence height that I think is justifiable here. So I'm glad we're supporting this and creating opportunities for those who need extenuating circumstances for larger fences. So well done.
So can you clarify your motion relative to your position on exceptions related to commercial, church, school, major thoroughfares?
I don't support a codified exception to those cases. If they want a taller fence because of that particular situation, I think they can come before come before the commission. And we can,
So what your motion really is stating that for an exception in these three circumstances, they similar to now related to front and side corner fence heights, they have the ability to submit for an increased fence height in these three circumstances, commercial, church or school, major thoroughfares, for up to 8 feet, but through the review and approval of the Site and Architectural Commission. Is that correct?
yeah, I don't know that we need to say that. I mean,
You would need to codify that ability, just like you currently have a codified section which allows people to apply for an exception of the front and side corner fence height from 3 feet up to 6 feet. You would have to codify that same ability for those in these specific circumstances to go from whatever the allowable fence height would be up to 8 feet.
making it complicated again.
Yeah.
Okay, no, it doesn't have to be that complicated. I think if we add, well, I would like to add commercial property. There are only 3 of them, but still, if it's a commercial, so I would add commercial property to the sharing a lot with the county for a
Wait, I have just a question for Jeannie. So let's say someone builds an ADU 4 feet from their fence line and they Airbnb that property out. Technically, that's a commercial property at that point, is it not? And we allow it, if it's a legal ADU, we allow Airbnbs, correct?
No, we don't. So if they're Airbnb-ing it out, they're in violation of the zoning regulations.
Gotcha.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Oh, okay. So Jeannie, then I would be okay with adding the ability to apply for exceptions in those other 3 cases then.
Well, let me just interject here, because I think we're a little bit backward instead of forward. One of the reasons that we originally elected not to go that route, I thought, and I could be wrong, was because that would create a more subjective evaluation of the exceptions, and without criteria by which those exceptions could be evaluated, and putting that in the body of the amendments to the municipal code, the reviewing body, whether it be Site and Architecture or another, would have no means by which to objectively evaluate each of those exceptions and make certain findings that would support it. And I thought we wanted to get away from that because we're feeling a lot of pressure to do that as it is. Why would we want to create another circumstance for that? So I don't know that Steve necessarily wants to withdraw his motion, but if we're having to deliver the basis by which exceptions are to be evaluated, I don't believe we are prepared tonight to do that. Or I'm not comfortable delivering exception criteria without findings of fact and objective means by which a reviewing body can consider those.
So currently, as the ordinance is proposed, because there is a current provision which allows for a property owner to apply for a site development permit to increase the fence height in the front or side corner setback from 3 feet up to 6 feet, the proposed ordinance would automatically increase that from 3 feet up to 7 feet. So they would still have to come to you. The question is, do you want to now expand that exception to properties on these defined major thoroughfares to allow to go up to 8 feet?
I'm confused by those comments, Jeannie, because I thought all the criteria, exception criteria, would be enveloped into what we're doing.
Well, no, that's what I think you guys are discussing. As proposed, there were basically, as proposed, there are 3 as of right exceptions. They don't have to come to you. And those as of right exceptions are for properties that have a shared property line with a commercially used. And none of those have a front property line that abuts a commercially used. So we're not dealing with that. And I know that may be, that was obvious to me. It may not be obvious to you. For those that have a shared property line with a church or a school, again, those are by default a side or a rear property line. Okay. Same thing with county. Again, it's not going to be a shared front property line with a side property line. So by default, those shared property lines are going to be probably in 99.9 cases, there may be that one out there, it's going to be a side or a rear property line. So, and again, also the way, if we just, modify the 6-foot citywide fence height to 7-foot citywide fence height, we would automatically, capture the current ability for property owners to apply to the Site and Architecture Commission for approval of a fence height increase in their front yard and side corner from 3 feet up to 7 feet.
Jeannie,
So
I
again,
have a quick question for you.
uh-huh.
So for a regular backyard fence that's not side yard or corner or anything like that, is it possible for someone to come in and apply for a 7-foot tall fence under the current 6-foot ordinance?
No, nobody can allow a fence height any higher than 6 feet currently.
Because it's not specifically noted as an exception that could occur if they go before.
And the language is specific that nobody, whether it be the Site and Architecture Commission or the council, can allow a fence height any taller than 6 feet.
I see.
So they can't seek a variance to the 6 feet. That's an easier way to say it. So again, the proposal is to basically just bump up everywhere there's 6 feet
To be
to 7 feet. Okay. So,
And Jeannie, this is Steve. Am I understanding you correct to say that if we are going to create exceptions, that we also have to develop the criteria by which those exceptions will be evaluated?
yeah, I mean, the current code, and I'm trying to find my, yeah, I don't really have it. Let me see if I can bring it up on my computer. How do I get the code? I can read the language to you, and it may be, let's see. Whoops, oh shit, where'd it go?
You can pull it up on our website.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
The more I look at this and the more I think about trying to be uniform, I think Steve's first motion makes the most sense, meaning that if the shared property line can be an 8-foot fence, sure, do an 8-foot, you can have an 8-foot fence, but everything else, including commercial, church, major thoroughfare, needs to get a variance. And there it's just cut and dried. If you can get, if somebody behind you can get an 8-foot fence, fine, you can do an 8-foot fence. Everything else, we raise it to 7 feet, and everything else besides the county abutment needs a variance.
But
But that's it. That's not exactly what you said to begin with, and I said, "Oh no, I think we need to change that." But I think it makes perfect sense. If the 8-foot can be there for your neighbor, obviously you can do an 8-foot fence.
All right, easily confused guy here. And I know you're reading the code, Jeannie, and I apologize for interrupting. But to Jennifer's point, if we don't carve out criteria for exceptions, if we don't carve out exceptions and criteria by which those exceptions will be evaluated, could such a request for an 8-foot fence in one of these exceptions that we're considering tonight be the subject of a variance to be granted to the landowner?
Well, you guys, I'm not going to use the term variance because City of Monte Sereno does not issue fence variances. It's basically an exception to the front and side corner from 3 feet up to 6 feet. And the current code language related to height of fences talks about, you know, it's limited to 3 feet in the front yard and side corner and 6 feet along whatever, unless a site development permit has been approved in accordance with Chapter 8 of this title. Chapter 8 being the site development permit process. So by default, they're kind of throwing you back to the findings for a site development permit when you approve one for an increase in fence height. Sometimes, you know, cities will have the findings for fence height modifications or exceptions a little more specific rather than the general, which is why I said, you know, if we do go down that road, we may want to direct staff to further research what might be more concise findings to be made, which would help any decision-making body when these requests came before them. Otherwise, you're looking at a fence height increase up to 8 feet where the proposed improvement is compatible with the character of the surrounding neighborhood. That may not, you know, so that's why I'm saying, you know, when you think through one that doesn't make absolute sense, you might want to direct staff or recommend to council that you have staff come back with more discrete findings related to fence height and that circumstance that that property owner has and why they're requesting the increase. So.
Okay, well, if we increase it to 7 feet, which is a foot higher, and then I believe when we were talking about it before, we really talked about how, well, if somebody can put an 8-foot fence in the backyard because it's county, then yes, that would be something that you could do. And does anyone really need any more variances? Maybe it's just 7 feet unless you abut, I mean, we're already raising it a foot. It's 7 feet unless you abut a county property.
Yeah, I mean, right now, if you abut a church or a school or a commercial property, it's 6 feet, right?
Correct, correct.
So we're already raising it a foot.
We're giving them a foot.
Yeah.
Good enough.
I think it's, yeah, I mean, after this discussion, when we're trying to massage things, I'm realizing we go back to the basics, and it's, you know, if somebody behind you can put an 8-foot fence in, yeah, you're going to have an 8-foot fence. But otherwise, we're raising a hard stop a whole foot. Do we need to do anything else?
I agree with you, Jennifer. Let's just make it simple.
Make it simple. And I think everyone will appreciate simplicity, especially the homeowners. You get a 7-foot fence.
All right, well, why don't maybe we should then just recommend the 7-foot increase and
With an 8-foot against county property.
and then the county
Do that, right? Because I mean, the person that lives in the county can put it on their side, and it can already be 8 feet. So we don't
put some god awful.
Right.
No, I think that exception is appropriate, and then recommend that, you know, these other exceptions be given further consideration for.
Or not. I mean, do we need to make further considerations? I'm throwing it out there.
Well, I feel
a hard stop at 6, we give it a hard stop at 7.
Yeah, but I feel like some of these exceptions are warranted in particular instances. There may be the need for an 8-foot fence in circumstances where you're on a major thoroughfare or next to a commercial property, or other things that I haven't even begun to consider.
Oh, geez.
Well, everybody's building mansions to themselves, you know, and so with these ADUs and other legislation coming down the road or down the pike, I think we should get this right. And I don't think we have enough information tonight to make a careful consideration of the exceptions. And so, with the exception of the county. And so I would encourage city council to ask staff to research that further and bring it before us at a later date.
And staff would just ask you to further clarify what you want me to research. Only because, again, there's no other, there are very few communities that allow 8-foot fences. And quite honestly, one that does, the discretion in a community development director is pretty nebulous. So I have a concern about that. So again, you can up it. That doesn't mean it stops there. If you think further research should be done in other areas, that can be done even after. You know, codes can continue to be amended. I guess I'm not trying to be argumentative or try to, you know, avoid work. I recognize that the exceptions it's a, both on the commission as well as the council, is a very real area of wanting to address. The concern is, you know, also how do we address it so that legally it makes sense and we're not, I'm going to throw another thing out, we're not kind of spot zoning. And even though these are fences, it does kind of relate to, you know, are we treating certain properties different than others? And if we are, will that, you know,
Well, as I
be
recall,
okay?
the only reason the 8-foot came into play was that the county has 8-foot 8-foot rules. So why are we giving anyone, why do we want to give anyone else the option of the 8 feet when it's legally an 8-foot fence for a county, but it's never been legally an 8-foot for here? In fact, it's been a 6-foot.
Jennifer, the way it works in Los Gatos is you are allowed an 8-foot fence in certain circumstances. And outside of those circumstances, you're allowed an 8-foot fence if you apply to the director of community planning and you meet specific criteria for an 8-foot fence. And if you choose to do an 8-foot fence and it is approved, then you must have submit building plans for that fence. So there's a lot of hurdles that you have to go through. It's not easy. And if you want to build a 7-foot fence, you can do that in Los Gatos, 6 feet with 1-foot lattice.
I have the Los Gatos regulations here, and you know, some of them again came out of, you know, an exception to any fence regulation may be granted by the community development director, not the planning commission, not any other sort of decision-making body, but the director. And the application has to demonstrate one of the following conditions: adjacent to commercial property, perimeter fences or walls may be 8 feet if requested or agreed upon by a majority of the adjacent residential property owners. Okay, I have a concern about that because, you know, putting that decision basically in the hands of adjacent property owners, that's dynamic. And, you know, that's subjective. So that's why in our proposed exception, we just said, if you're adjacent to commercial property owner, 8 feet. Director of community development doesn't have to weigh in on it, nor do adjacent property owners. When there are special privacy concerns exist, that's going to be every single property in the city because everybody thinks that they have a privacy concern. So although some of these are done in Los Gatos, they're on the books, but very difficult to administer and quite honestly subjective in a world where we're really having to move to objective standards. So whether that decision be put at the Director of Community Development or in front of another decision-making body, we really need to move towards the direction of objective standards, or pretty objective performance criteria. That if you do 8 feet, is there going to be a required, 3-foot buffer between the property line? Because an 8-foot fence along a property line on the sidewalk or along the street of a major thoroughfare, there's a big difference between 6 feet and 8 feet, even between 7 feet and 8 feet. I live in a community where you can have a 7-foot tall fence. 2 of my fences, one is 7 feet and the one perpendicular to it is 6 feet. The 7 feet isn't overwhelming. If it went 1 foot higher, even on we all have single story homes, that would be a little overwhelming and it would feel a little high. So that's why initially, the difference between a 6 and 7 is much different than between when you go all the way up to 8, just from a feel, on the smaller lots at least, as well as having to get a building permit. So keeping it simple, the proposal is to allow the 7 feet as of right because you don't need building permits. Any exceptions, it's got to be, as objective, and if you can do it as of right. And was kind of the purpose of the survey, to see, who was in favor of it and how many properties are involved. Those are easy to track also. And, the third one is a lot more properties on major thoroughfares. And are we prepared to entertain that exception? You don't have to entertain any exceptions. You can entertain 1, you can entertain 2, you can entertain 3. If you think you'd like to entertain another but aren't quite ready, you need to decide if you want to hold up the whole proposal or recommend, certain changes, but also say, but we're also very interested in further looking into exceptions in this area. And we'd like a little more information. Maybe it's, let's map out the city relative to properties. I know there's approximately 142 because I counted them, but how would it look? Which ones would we anticipate worst case coming in? So that's the sort of work that I would envision staff would have to go through to help any decision-making body decide whether or not they even want to allow for others to have the ability to go up to 8 feet. Just my 5 cents. I know it's more than 2.
Well, I am a fan of doing the 7 feet across the board and 8 feet with abutting jurisdictions. And then having to get a building permit for anything else.
And I'm a fan of all those things. I'm also a fan of, if you're next to a church or a school, I think it would be okay to have an 8-foot fence. I don't have an opinion on, well, I'm leaning towards the 7 feet in the corridor, like along Winchester and Quito, to keep it 7 feet, but I'm still on the, I don't want to really call it on that at this point, I guess. If we could continue that portion of it, is possible.
So we can say we agree with raising the overall fence height to 7 feet, and then table the exceptions. I mean, other than if it abuts a jurisdiction that allows 8.
I'm prepared tonight to entertain such a motion.
Yeah, and again, you're recommending. You're not you know, and you can recommend, you know, anything. You don't have to come to a final decision per se. You're in a position of really just having to recommend to them. So if what's before you today is there's a bulk of it that you feel comfortable with, you can recommend that be included in an ordinance. And then you can include as part of your recommendation reference to certain aspects of the proposal that you're not comfortable with moving forward, and why, and what you'd like seeing done with it. Maybe you don't want to see it move forward at all. Maybe you want to see staff do more work to bring that aspect of the proposal back for further consideration at a later date. So again, you can piece out, you know, the provisions in the proposal and move forward with a recommendation on aspects that you feel totally comfortable with. And you can have a different recommendation on aspects that you feel need, you know, more time spent to give you more information such that you can feel comfortable with a recommendation on those aspects.
Brian, when I believe you said that Los Gatos does not get an automatic 8-foot fence height.
I had thought that there's an automatic fence height if you were adjacent to a commercial property.
Okay,
That's
but adjacent to a residential property, it's not an automatic. So the county is the only jurisdiction that abuts us that has an 8-foot fence height.
I believe that is correct. But so I own a property at 55 Roberts Road in Los Gatos.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an HOA, and we've got a swimming pool. And the neighbor immediately adjacent that, we applied for an 8-foot fence exemption. So the director of planning could review it and bring it up to 8 feet. We had to describe what the materials were going to be. We had to have a plan for the fence, and we had to have all of the adjacent neighbors sign off on that plan. And we had to get a building permit.
Yeah, so that's an exception that requires an application
Yeah.
to be approved by the community development director. So it's not an as of right.
Okay, my wish right now is to, since we're not going to agree on everything, we want more information on some things. I think if we can agree on a couple things, we can move forward. And I think what we agree on is the across the board 7 feet with 8 feet abutting county because the county is 8 feet. And after that, we want more information. We want to talk about it more. And well, first of all, do we agree on those first two premises?
I think we do, and that's where we got hung up, because we're just about to, or we were in the process of voting on that motion when it was brought to our attention we needed to provide additional information if we're going to go that route. And now, is it that no longer the case that we can just make recommendations that be investigated further and that those exceptions be evaluated further? Can we do it that way?
Yeah, if you don't feel the proposed as of right exception up to 8 feet for properties with shared with commercially used property or church and school, yeah. But again, you know, whether it's those are at question or it's just the major thoroughfare are at question. So.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, it's my thought that those other 3 exceptions outside of abutting commercial property have somehow survived today with 6-foot fences. And has it been a huge problem? Is there been an outroar of those relatively few properties about why they can't build an 8-foot fence? or are we just creating an exception because we feel maybe they should get it? What's the driver behind creating this exception when we're already bumping it up a foot, I guess, is what I'm trying to understand.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. I believe, I'm kind of thinking the same thing.
So
Where did the 8 foot across, where did the 8 foot exceptions come from?
there are a lot of 8-foot fences in Monte Sereno.
Well, that's a given. We all know that. but we're moving, we're putting stuff in the code here. You know, and I do understand that there are going to be some exceptions, and I don't want to, I guess, I don't want to shut the door on it completely. And maybe that's what Jeannie's saying. Well, if you don't allow for these other things to be considered explicitly, then you're pretty much shutting the door on them, right? Is that what I'm hearing, Jeannie?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you all need to feel comfortable with is, if you're adjacent to a commercial property, do you think 7 feet sufficient? If you're adjacent to the school or the church, we know what they are. If people can now go up to 7 feet, do you think that's okay? Do you think they need an exception? You know, we can backtrack. It doesn't, you don't have to, you know, we have the opportunity to, you know, further think through what the previous discussions held.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
the exception to 8 feet for the county is not really an exception per se, because the county property can put up an 8 feet. That's more just for consistency.
right,
Okay.
right.
The others would be true exceptions to allow for an additional 1 foot up to 8 feet, because we feel that a commercially used property, you know, the 3 in the city are the one that is adjacent to the first property in Monte Sereno on Saratoga Los Gatos Road. You've got that little strip center that has a mix of uses that may have more traffic, may have more activity. So the thought is, you know, an additional increase to 8 feet would help to buffer any impact that commercial use may have on it. It is consistent with a couple other communities, albeit the other communities make you go through an application process, but, you know, we got 3 commercial adjacent properties. So do we need to make them go through it, or is it just as of right? Again, you know, in the case of fencing, as much as you can make it as of right, the better off you are, because people don't think in terms of having to get a discretionary permit for a fence. So same thing. Originally, when it came before you, we only had the commercial, the county and the commercial. When the council discussed it, they brought up some other ideas all of a sudden, which is why it went back. And I think it was Council Member Luthold said, well, you know, what about now if you're adjacent to a church or a school, you know, all the activities there. So they put it back to staff to reach out to the community to see what does the community think about that. So even though it went before council as previously directed, with the 7 up to 7 feet plus the exception to the county, when it came before them, they thought a little more, and oh, well, maybe there's a couple other instances where we could consider the exceptions, which is why I included it in a survey to see whether or not. And just because the public is overly supportive of it doesn't mean the city has to include it, because the public may not, you know, think broadly and, you know, citywide and visual impact and stuff like that. So again, you have the ability to think through this one more time because the council had some additional thoughts on what they had previously directed staff to do.
Is the criteria for those three exceptions fuzzy in any way, or is it pretty hard? Like, there's no,
It's pretty hard. So the
Is it-
three
it's
exceptions of
subjective?
county, adjacent to a county, you're either in the county or you're not.
well, that one I know for sure, but the other,
Commercial it's pretty clear. It's the commercially used, and we have properties, like I said, the commercial uses that are adjacent to city properties are the few in Los Gatos. There's a medical office on Winchester where some city properties abut. I think maybe one does, if any. Yeah, I think one does, yeah. Or a couple on Via Sereno back up to it. There's the one on Los Gatos Saratoga Road. There may be one across the street on Los Gatos Saratoga. The church or school, again, we have the church on Dave's Avenue, we have the school on Dave's Avenue, and then we have a church that is in City of Los Gatos, but again, we're not distinguishing where the church is. So it's really those properties that ring. And one church, most of the Monte Sereno properties that abut it, they're abutting parking area and some open space. But again, the number of properties are limited, and those are more, that fencing will be more internal to the sites and will have less of a visual impact on any streetscapes. The ones that it may not be fuzzy because it's very clear whether you're on those identified major thoroughfares. The bigger concern is that additional feet from 7 to 8. Do we think that's warranted? Because that will just add an additional foot to that walling.
I mean, that's
So
the one I really don't like. I mean, all of a sudden we're going to have 8-foot fences along the major arterials as an exception. I mean, I don't know.
I agree, Steve.
I'm not super excited about that. I mean, okay, if you're against the county, that's a no-brainer because they can build a higher one. If it's a church or a school or a commercial property, those are pretty well defined because those are zoning. Those properties are zoned, and either you do or you do not share a common property line with them. The only one that's kind of hanging out there for me is the major arterials, and there's a fair amount of them. There's 142, and why would they need a taller fence in the back or the side yard? If they're going to benefit from a taller fence, it's going to be along the road, and I don't know that an 8-foot fence along those roads is something we want to entertain.
and they already would have the ability to come in and request a fence over 3 feet up to 7 feet. And through the site development permit process, you can decide whether or not there's an appropriate setback from a sidewalk or to buffer the impacts of any sort of fence and help in the design element of those requests. So that provision remains. So anybody who fronts onto a major thoroughfare will still have the ability to request a fence height over 3 feet up to, should it be approved, 7 feet through the site development permit process, which is a process that you guys already administer citywide.
So what about entertaining basically the motion that I made, but modifying it such that both commercial properties and properties abutting churches or schools also have the option to going to 8 feet, but not the arterials. I mean, that's kind of already covered up to 7 feet in areas where they probably couldn't put a 7-foot fence to begin with, right? Because if it's a side yard or a front property line, they already have the option of going from 3 to now 7 by the way the code's written.
I would second that motion.
Am I making any sense, or am I just spinning in circles more?
No, I think you're making perfect sense. We're doing the 7 feet fence with the only 8-foot exception is county or commercial, school and church. Boom.
I
I
understand.
think all motions are ended with boom now.
Yeah. Booyah.
I was gonna do mic drop, but you know.
Okay, so what she said, with the exception of the boom,
Boom.
that's so moved. Yes, Jennifer?
Yes.
All right, and is there a second?
So I'm seconding my original motion plus the additional 2 exceptions beyond commercial, I'm sorry, beyond county, and those would be church or school or commercial. So, do I have that right?
That's my understanding.
Okay, then I would second that.
Okay, let's go with a vote. Steve, do you support the motion?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
Heather?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
I'm gonna vote no. I think we can do better. Sorry, guys.
Hey, it's your.
But we did get through a motion, and that means we're at the end of the agenda. In that respect, I'm very proud of all of you. Any other business that we need to take care of, Ms. Hamilton, before we adjourn?
I don't believe so. But just to reiterate that motion passed 4-1 with Commissioner White in opposition. Chairperson White in opposition, correct?
Yes. And not angry about it, just in opposition.
Not taking it personal, Steve.
No, I don't.
Oh, we don't take anything personal here in this city.
Redwood trees and redwood fences, I treat them equally. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
Last night.
I'll make the motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Well done. Thank you very much, Ms. Hamilton. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
See y'all next time.
See you guys next time.
All right, bye.